Security! Get this boy out before he contaminates something.
SOS.
The doctor's voice thundered across Chicago Memorial Hospital. But Jerome, just 10 years old, didn't flinch. He had walked through freezing rain with one message burning in his chest. Please, I just want to help the girl in the wheelchair. I know how to make her walk. The first snow of December fell quietly over Manhattan, softening the sharp edges of the city that never truly slept. New York Presbyterian Hospital rose against the gray skyline like a fortress of glass and steel, its revolving doors turning constantly as patients, visitors, and staff came and went. The air outside was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that clung to the bones, while the inside glowed with a sterile warmth, a hum of fluorescent lights and muffled footsteps on polished floors. It was here, on this day when the city was wrapped in frost and hurry, that a boy with tangled hair and a blind dog changed the course of more lives than he could have ever imagined. Ethan Miller was 12 years old, but wore the weight of someone much older. His hair was dark brown, messy as though combed only by the wind, and his eyes, startlingly green, burned with a quiet fire. He wore a gray hoodie that sagged at the elbows, the fabric pilled and frayed from years of use, and a pair of jeans with a tear at the knee that revealed a thin, frost-bitten leg. His sneakers were scuffed, soles uneven from too many miles, walked without rest. Ethan's shoulders carried an invisible heaviness, the burden of loneliness since the death of his grandmother, the only adult who had truly cared for him. Despite his young age, there was a stubborn dignity in his walk, the kind of defiance born not of arrogance, but of survival. Beside him padded Shadow, a German shepherd unlike any other. Shadow was 8 years old, his once proud gait slowed by age and injury. His fur was a mixture of charcoal and ash, thick and slightly coarse, with streaks of white running down his muzzle like premature snow. What made him most remarkable, however, was his blindness. His eyes, once sharp and golden, had long clouded over, now hidden beneath a white scarf tied gently across his face. To anyone watching, it might have seemed cruel or pitiful, but to Ethan, it was a symbol of dignity. Shadow was not broken. He was a survivor. Each step the dog took was careful, deliberate, but unshaken, as though he could still sense the world through something deeper than sight. The boy and his dog pushed through the hospital's front entrance, their presence immediately at odds with the pristine marble lobby. Ethan's sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor, leaving faint streaks of melted snow. Shadow's nails tapped softly, his head lifted as if he could smell the anxiety, sickness, and antiseptic that floated invisibly in the air. Nurses in pale blue scrubs glanced over briefly before hurrying on. Families whispered in corners, and doctors strode past in white coats, their eyes fixed on charts and phones. But within seconds, security noticed the boy. "Kid, you can't be here with that dog," a tall security guard muttered, already moving toward him. His name tag read Miller, though he bore no relation to Ethan. He was a large man in his 40s, with heavy jowls and tired eyes, more annoyed than cruel, but accustomed to removing the unwanted from this space. Ethan did not flinch. His voice, though small, carried an unusual steadiness. "Please, I need to see Sarah Carter." The mention of that name rippled through the air, catching the attention of several nurses nearby. Sarah Carter, the daughter of Dr. William Carter, head neurosurgeon and one of the most respected men in the hospital. A girl who, despite the most advanced treatments, had not spoken more than a few scattered sounds in 2 years, who had not walked since she was a toddler. Sarah was both a sorrow and a symbol, proof that even the greatest doctors could not always conquer nature. At that very moment, the elevator doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Dr. William Carter himself emerged, pushing his daughter's wheelchair. William Carter was a man of commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered even in his 40s, his hair silver at the temples, his face severe with the kind of lines carved not only by age but by endless responsibility. His white coat fit him like armor, and his eyes, ice gray, sharp as a scalpel, rarely betrayed anything but authority. To his colleagues, he was a genius and a perfectionist. To his patients, a savior. But to his daughter, he was simply a father, desperate to fix what could not be fixed. In the wheelchair sat Sarah Carter, 8 years old, her small body dwarfed by the machinery that surrounded her. She had fine blonde hair that fell in soft waves to her shoulders, a pale face touched with freckles, and large blue eyes that seemed always to be staring into some unreachable distance. Sarah had been born with a neurological disorder that limited her motor control and speech, and though she was intelligent, her body often betrayed her. She had spent most of her life in therapy, learning to manage frustration and isolation. Over the years, her silence had become a wall between her and the world, her laughter a rare and fragile thing. When Ethan and Shadow stepped into view, Sarah's gaze, usually glassy and detached, sharpened. She leaned forward slightly, her small hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. And then it happened. Her lips parted, and in a voice cracked but clear, she whispered one single word: "Doggy." The sound froze the hall. Nurses stopped in their tracks. The security guard's hand fell away from Ethan's shoulder. Even Dr. Carter's stern face faltered for a moment, his eyes widening in disbelief. For 2 years, his daughter had not spoken anything more than scattered syllables, and now, to a stranger's dog, she had spoken. Ethan felt his heart surge, not with pride, but with recognition, as if some invisible string had pulled the two children together. He knelt down beside Sarah's wheelchair, so his eyes met hers. "Hi, Princess," he said softly, his voice filled with a warmth he rarely showed. "Do you want to meet my friend Shadow?" Sarah's hands reached out, trembling but eager. Shadow, though blind, seemed to sense her fragile excitement. He stepped forward carefully, lowering his great head onto her lap. His body was strong, his scars hidden beneath thick fur, but the gentleness in his movement was unmistakable. Sarah's face lit up with something more than joy. It was connection, a spark breaking through years of silence. Dr. Carter, however, stiffened, pushing the wheelchair slightly back. "Sarah, no," he said in a low, urgent voice. His instinct was protection, control, the defense of a man who had tried for years to shield his daughter from false hope. He looked sharply at Ethan. "Who are you? What do you think you're doing here?" Ethan rose slowly, his gaze unwavering despite the power radiating from the man before him. "My name is Ethan Miller," he said, his words clear, "and I can help her walk." The hallway seemed to hold its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. Snow continued to fall outside the great glass windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside. Sarah, her small fingers still buried in Shadow's fur, turned her eyes from her father to the boy who spoke with impossible certainty. For the first time in years, hope flickered in her gaze. The snow outside thickened as dusk settled over New York City, the skyscrapers glowing faintly through the curtain of white. Inside New York Presbyterian Hospital, however, the air was far from serene. The sterile brightness of the marble lobby seemed to grow harsher under the weight of tension. Ethan Miller, his clothes still damp from melted snow, stood firm despite the sharp voice of Dr. William Carter. Sarah Carter, the 8-year-old in the wheelchair, clutched Shadow's thick fur with fragile hands, unwilling to let go. Dr. Carter loomed over the boy like a figure of judgment. His gray eyes blazed, though beneath the fury there was the faintest glimmer of unease. The man was tall, his white coat immaculate, his tie knotted with precision, and his entire being exuded authority. He was a surgeon used to being obeyed, a father used to controlling every variable he could grasp. His temper, though usually hidden behind professionalism, cracked now in front of staff and strangers alike. "You have no right to be here," he thundered. "Security, remove this child immediately." Before the guards could respond, a woman's voice broke the moment. "Wait." Dr. Evelyn Brooks had just entered from the side corridor. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet strength. Her dark auburn hair was tied back neatly, her hazel eyes calm yet piercing. She wore her white coat loosely over a soft blue blouse, a contrast to Carter's rigid formality. Having transferred recently from California, she was not yet embedded in the hospital's hierarchy, which allowed her to observe without the chains of loyalty. Evelyn had a reputation among colleagues for patience, empathy, and a kind of intuitive intelligence that valued connection as much as textbook science. Now, her gaze was fixed not on Ethan, but on Sarah. The girl, who often sat listlessly in her chair during treatments, was alive with a spark Evelyn had never witnessed. Sarah's pale face was flushed, her blue eyes wide, her lips parting as if she wanted to say more. Her thin frame trembled with effort, but her small arm extended toward Ethan, reaching with a desperation that could not be ignored. "Doctor, Carter," Evelyn said evenly. "Look at your daughter. She's responding." Carter's jaw tightened. "It's a coincidence? She doesn't know what she's doing. This boy is manipulating her." Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm not manipulating her. I'm telling the truth. You misdiagnosed her. You've been treating her for the wrong condition." His green eyes burned with an intensity far beyond his years. Gasps echoed softly among the staff who had gathered to watch. The audacity of the words alone was enough to stir scandal, but the unshakable conviction in Ethan's tone gave them weight. Dr. Carter's face darkened, not with confusion but with anger rooted in fear. He leaned closer to Ethan, his voice a hiss. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy." Ethan didn't flinch. "Yes, I do. And deep down, so do you." The words struck like a blow, though Carter's stern mask did not break fully. He straightened, his hand tightening on the wheelchair handle, but Sarah resisted, her small fingers tightening around Shadow's fur, as if she could anchor herself to Ethan's presence. The blind dog stood calmly, massive head still resting in her lap, unaware of the storm of authority and defiance raging around him. It was then that a new voice entered, gentle but firm. "I know that dog." The speaker was Nurse Margaret Lane, one of the hospital's oldest staff members. In her late 60s, Margaret was short and slightly stooped from years of long shifts, but her eyes, soft brown and still sharp, carried the wisdom of decades spent in pediatric wards. Her hands were strong though wrinkled, veins visible like delicate maps. She was known for her kindness, always carrying peppermint candies for frightened children, and her blunt honesty with doctors, which often earned her both respect and irritation. Now she moved closer, peering at Shadow with recognition. "That German shepherd. He was in the news 3 years ago. The building collapse in Queens. I remember." Curiosity rippled through the crowd. Dr. Brooks tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Margaret's voice softened, touched with reverence. "There was a fire and a partial collapse of an old apartment building. Search and rescue teams went in, and this dog, this very one, went in with them. He found 2 children trapped under the rubble, saved them. But he was caught in an aftershock of falling debris. By the time they pulled him out, he'd lost his sight. I remember the photo of him lying on a stretcher, bandaged but still alive. They called him a hero." All eyes turned to Shadow. The great dog stood motionless, his blind eyes hidden by the white scarf, but his very presence seemed transformed by the revelation. He was not just a stray, not a burden dragged in by a street boy. He was a survivor, a savior once, a creature who had already given his sight so that others could live. The hospital staff shifted uncomfortably, as though ashamed of their earlier judgment. "Even without eyes, he's leading her now," Margaret murmured, her gaze flicking toward Sarah's trembling hands on Shadow's fur. "Sometimes it's not about seeing. Sometimes it's about feeling." Dr. Carter's lips thinned. He despised the way sentiment clouded reason, but the atmosphere had shifted against him. Still, he raised his chin, clinging to authority. "That doesn't change the fact that this boy is trespassing." Ethan spoke again, his voice steadier than ever. "I came because I saw her through the window last week. I saw how she tried to move, how she responded when she thought no one was watching. My grandmother taught me to recognize the signs. She worked with children like her. Sarah doesn't have what you think she has. You're treating the wrong illness, and it's keeping her trapped." Dr. Brooks studied Ethan closely, noting not only his words, but the way Sarah responded to him. The girl was leaning toward Ethan, her lips moving soundlessly as if trying to form another word. Evelyn's heart tightened. She had read Sarah's file, knew the years of therapy, the endless frustration. To see this spark now, this fight, was unlike anything she had imagined. Carter bristled, ready to strike the boy down with words sharper than his scalpel, but before he could, Sarah let out a sound. It wasn't a word, not yet, but a broken syllable, her lips pressing hard, her throat straining. Her hand reached again toward Ethan. The entire lobby seemed to lean in, breaths held. "She wants him," Evelyn said quietly. "She wants to be near him." Dr. Carter's face turned to stone, but his hand trembled slightly on the wheelchair handle. Years of certainty, of status, of carefully constructed walls around his reputation were being threatened not by another surgeon, not by science, but by a ragged boy and a blind dog. He felt the ground beneath him shift, and he hated it. Shadow, unaware of reputations or pride, gave a low, steady woof, the kind of sound that spoke of reassurance. His body was still, but his presence filled the room with a calm strength. He had once guided rescuers through fire and ruin without sight. Now he guided a silent girl toward her first connection in years. And in that moment, though Carter's fury remained, though his pride clung stubbornly, the hospital itself seemed to whisper of something greater, of truths buried, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The snow had slowed by the time evening lamps flickered on along the avenues of Manhattan, but the city was still wrapped in a quiet hush. Inside New York Presbyterian Hospital, however, silence was impossible. The lobby, only moments earlier humming with restrained order, now vibrated with whispers, exchanged glances, and the electric weight of something unusual unfolding before their eyes. Sarah Carter sat in her wheelchair, her pale fingers still entangled in the thick fur of Shadow, the blind German shepherd whose scarfed eyes seemed to guard more secrets than sight could ever reveal. Ethan Miller, with his wiry frame and untamed hair, stepped closer. He crouched so his gaze was level with Sarah's, his voice steady and filled with a tenderness rare in one so young. "My grandmother," he began, "was a nurse. She worked with children like her." He nodded gently toward Sarah. "She taught me that sometimes the body doesn't respond to commands from a doctor's voice or machines. Sometimes it responds to patience, to touch, to someone who doesn't give up." There was a murmur among the staff. Some recognized the surname Miller, recalling Nurse Louise Miller, a woman who had once worked quietly but brilliantly in rehabilitation therapy before her passing. Ethan's resemblance to her, those sharp green eyes, that same stubborn calm, was impossible to miss now that he had spoken her name. Sarah's blue eyes widened at Ethan's words, as though something in his tone resonated with her silent world. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, her breathing quickening, anticipation rippling through her frail body. Dr. William Carter's expression, however, hardened, his square jaw clenched, his silvering hair catching the sterile light, his hand tightening on the wheelchair handle. Authority had always been his shield, and now a boy threatened to pierce it with nothing more than stories and audacity. "This is absurd," he muttered. "We are not here to indulge in fairy tales about grandmothers." But Dr. Evelyn Brooks, standing at Carter's side, raised her hand gently. "Let him try," she said softly, her auburn hair glinting in the overhead light. "If there is no harm, what is there to lose?" Ethan glanced at Sarah, then at Shadow, whose ears pricked despite his blindness, as though he too awaited something momentous. The boy extended his hand slowly toward Sarah's bare foot, pale against the black padding of the wheelchair rest. His fingers brushed lightly at the arch, the way his grandmother had once shown him, not pressing, but coaxing. "Sometimes," Ethan whispered, "the nerves need reminding that they can still speak to the body." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, one of Sarah's toes twitched. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Sarah herself froze, eyes wide, then tried again. This time, her toes moved distinctly, curling as though waking from a long slumber. Her lips parted in wonder, and a small sound escaped. A breathy laugh, broken but alive. Dr. Carter's face paled. He leaned down quickly, adjusting her leg as though searching for an explanation. "It could be a spasm," he said sharply. "Involuntary. Don't mistake it for more than it is." But his voice lacked its usual steel. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he continued gently, tapping a rhythm along Sarah's calf, murmuring encouragement, coaxing rather than commanding. And again, Sarah responded. Her foot jerked upward, not in a chaotic spasm, but in a deliberate attempt. Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in years, she had control, however small. Dr. Brooks covered her mouth with her hand, her hazel eyes shimmering. She had seen countless children in therapy, endless disappointments, but this was different. This was no accident. This was awakening. Meanwhile, a different story unfolded just beyond the lobby. Down the corridor, in the pediatric wing, a boy no older than 6 sat on the edge of his hospital bed, his thin shoulders shaking as he sobbed quietly into his hands. His name was Thomas Gray, a child with leukemia whose treatments had left him weak and afraid. His dark hair had thinned to patches, and his pale skin bore the pallor of too many nights under fluorescent lights. He wept not from pain alone, but from loneliness, missing the comfort of home. Unseen at first, Shadow's ears swiveled. Though blind, the old shepherd sensed the sound. Slowly, guided only by instinct and the pull of sorrow, he padded down the hall, his nails clicking softly against the tile. Nurses looked on in surprise as the scarfed dog stopped before the boy's room. With a nudge of his massive head, he pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. Thomas looked up, startled, his tear-streaked face lifting. Shadow approached carefully, lowering his body to lie beside the bed. Though his eyes could not see, his head rested gently against the boy's knee, radiating warmth and weight. The sobbing slowed. Tentatively, Thomas's small hand brushed over Shadow's fur. The dog gave a low rumble, not a growl but a soothing vibration, a sound of presence. The boy's lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. A nurse passing by, a young woman named Clara, with dark braids and a tired expression, stopped and stared. "He found him," she whispered to herself. "He knew." Word spread quickly among the staff who had followed the commotion from the lobby. Many had dismissed Ethan and Shadow moments before, but now they exchanged glances filled with awe. Back in the lobby, the demonstration continued. Sarah's legs shook, her muscles weak from years of neglect, but the signals were there. Her fingers gripped the armrests with determination, her lips forming silent shapes as though she wished desperately to speak again. Ethan leaned closer, his hoodie sleeves slipping back to reveal thin wrists scarred with childhood. Scrapes, the marks of a life lived without comfort, but not without resilience. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured to her. "You just need someone to believe it." Dr. Carter's authority wavered. His eyes flicked between his daughter's trembling movements and the boy who dared to challenge his years of training. Sweat dotted his temple though the air was cool. He wanted to shout again, to dismiss, to claim accident. But the truth quivered in Sarah's every twitch, and beneath his denial was a deeper fear, that he had failed her, that pride had blinded him longer than Shadow's scarf had blinded the dog. Dr. Brooks finally stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with certainty. "William, look at her. This isn't chance. This is response. You know as well as I do what this means." The surgeon said nothing. His silence was louder than any denial. In the pediatric wing, Shadow remained with Thomas. The boy had stopped crying, his small hand still buried in the shepherd's fur. Clara, the nurse, knelt by the doorway, her eyes glistening. "That dog," she whispered, "has a gift." To those who saw it, Shadow became more than a companion. He was a reminder that guidance could come even without sight, that healing was not always born of medicine alone. And so, in 2 corners of the hospital, the same truth unfolded. The human spirit could be stirred not by machines, but by patience, presence, and the refusal to surrender hope. The corridors of New York Presbyterian Hospital buzzed with restrained tension, as though the walls themselves could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The snow outside had quieted, muffling the city's chaos into a strange stillness. Inside, however, hearts were pounding. Ethan Miller stood in the center of the therapy room, his wiry frame taut but steady, his hoodie sleeves pushed back to reveal hands that trembled, not with fear, but anticipation. Beside him sat Sarah Carter, her blonde hair falling over her pale shoulders, her wide blue eyes locked on Ethan, as though he was the only anchor in a world that had so often left her adrift. Dr. William Carter hovered near the door, his broad shoulders rigid, his gray eyes sharp with authority, but shadowed with unease. The immaculate white coat he wore seemed heavier tonight, as if it carried not prestige, but the burden of secrets. He was a man who had spent decades ensuring his name stood untarnished, and now a boy threatened to unravel it. At his side, Dr. Evelyn Brooks observed in silence, her hazel eyes intent, her auburn hair escaping slightly from its tie, softening her serious face. Evelyn's heart raced with a doctor's curiosity and a woman's compassion. She wanted desperately to see if hope truly lived in the boy's conviction. Ethan broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying across the room. "If I'm wrong, you'll never see me or Shadow again. But if I'm right, Sarah deserves her chance." The words hit like a challenge, echoing with the audacity of truth. A few nurses who had lingered near the doorway exchanged glances, unsure whether to gasp or cheer. Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a hard line. "This is reckless," he snapped. "She could fall. She could injure herself. Do you have any idea the consequences?" Ethan's green eyes did not waver. "The consequence of doing nothing is worse." The boy's tone, neither angry nor pleading, simply certain, struck Evelyn harder than any medical argument she had heard in years. She took a cautious step forward. "William," she said softly, "we need to let him try. We owe Sarah that much." Carter shot her a furious glare, but her calm gaze did not falter. For the first time in years, someone challenged him, not with arrogance, but with empathy. He turned away, unwilling to answer. Ethan bent to Sarah's level, his voice gentle. "Princess, do you want to try standing?" Sarah's lips trembled. She had not spoken since the single miraculous word, "Doggy!" But her fingers gripped the armrest tightly, her small body straining with determination. Ethan slipped his hands under her arms, careful and patient, and together they began the impossible. Her legs shook violently, unused to carrying weight, her knees buckling like thin branches in a storm. Yet inch by inch, Sarah rose. Her eyes widened with shock at her own strength. The entire room froze, watching a child they believed doomed to. While silence and stillness began to defy every expectation. Dr. Carter's face drained of color. "Stop this!" he barked, stepping forward. But Sarah whimpered, a sound halfway between fear and defiance, and clung harder to Ethan. For the first time in her life, she was choosing, not obeying. Shadow, the blind shepherd, moved instinctively. His heavy paws padded to Sarah's side. Though his white scarf covered sightless eyes, he lifted his head high, ears pricked, body firm like a sentinel. His fur brushed against Sarah's leg, steadying her. The symbolism was unmistakable, a blind dog, unmoved by fate, standing as an equal partner beside a fragile girl fighting her first steps. Two survivors against the destiny imposed upon them. A nurse named Daniel, tall and broad with a calm face, whispered hoarsely from the back. "She's standing. She's actually standing." Sarah swayed, her legs trembling, but Ethan steadied her. "Don't look at the ground," he whispered. "Feel Shadow next to you. He's your strength." Her lips formed a soundless word. "Yes." Though her voice did not rise. She took a shaky half-step, then another, her small hands gripping Ethan's arms like lifelines. Dr. Carter's knees nearly buckled. His pride, carefully built over decades, crumbled in an instant. "It's impossible," he muttered, though his voice cracked. "It has to be reflex, coincidence." Ethan turned, his green eyes piercing. "It's not coincidence. It's truth. You misdiagnosed her. You've known something was wrong with your conclusion, but you were too afraid to admit it." The words sliced through the air. The room felt colder, the hum of the lights suddenly louder. Evelyn's gaze flicked sharply to Carter, her brows narrowing. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Say it," Ethan pressed, his young voice shaking now with righteous anger. "Say that you've been wrong, or are you going to let your pride keep her in that chair forever?" Dr. Carter's hands trembled at his sides. Sweat trickled down his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tight. He had lived a lifetime convincing others of certainty. Now he stood exposed, uncertain in front of his own child. Sarah whimpered again, and for a moment her knees began to buckle. Shadow pressed his shoulder against her shin, steadying her with his silent strength. She straightened again, a tiny defiance, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The sight sent a shockwave through the staff watching. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice firm. "William, enough. Look at her. This is real." For the first time in years, William Carter's shoulders sagged. His gray eyes, once sharp with control, flickered with shame and fear. The truth was no longer something he could suppress. Ethan held Sarah close, his voice low but steady. She doesn't need perfection. She needs honesty. She needs someone willing to give her a chance. Sarah clung to both Ethan and Shadow, her thin body trembling, but her spirit blazing brighter than anyone had seen. In that fragile, miraculous moment, the clash between truth and pride reached its breaking point. The snow had melted into the gutters of New York, leaving behind a crisp, cool breeze that swept down the avenues like a fresh promise. Spring was unfolding, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably, just as something new was beginning inside the Carter family. The therapy room where tension once threatened to crush them now glowed with a kind of hushed reverence, as if the walls themselves bore witness to the miracle. Sarah Carter, frail but determined, took small but undeniable steps forward, her tiny hands held by Ethan Miller. Ethan's brown hair, forever tousled, fell into his green eyes as he glanced at Sarah. He wore his gray hoodie still, sleeves frayed, but there was something new in his posture, pride not for himself, but for the girl beside him. Sarah's blue eyes, once dulled by silence, now shone like the first light on fresh snow. Every wobbling step she took was not just a defiance of her diagnosis, but a declaration of life itself. Dr. William Carter, usually so controlled, collapsed into a chair at the far side of the room. His shoulders trembled, and for the first time in decades, tears streamed down his face. His carefully kept mask of authority shattered in front of nurses, colleagues, and his daughter. He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. My God, Sarah, I was wrong. Forgive me." Sarah, in her unsteady stance, did something no one expected. She let go of Ethan with one trembling hand and stretched her arm toward her father. Though her words had not fully returned, her gesture spoke louder than anything language could muster. William staggered forward, dropping to his knees in front of her. His broad frame shook as he pressed his forehead to her tiny hand, his voice a whisper. "I'm so sorry, my little girl. I let my pride blind me. Please forgive me." The room fell silent, broken only by the soft shuffle of Shadow. The German shepherd, his white scarf fluttering against his dark fur, padded toward them. Though his eyes were clouded by blindness, his presence was commanding. He stood between Sarah and her father for a moment, as if to weigh the sincerity of the man's remorse, before lowering his head and resting it gently against William's arm. It was as though Shadow had granted forgiveness on behalf of Sarah, bestowing grace where pride had once ruled. Ethan stepped back, uncertain, his heart swelling with both relief and exhaustion. He had carried this secret, his grandmother's wisdom, his belief in Sarah's hidden strength, for so long, and now it was no longer just his burden. Dr. Evelyn Brooks touched Ethan's shoulder, her expression soft. "You've done more here than most physicians dream of doing," she murmured, "and you're just a boy." Ethan shook his head. "I just listened. That's all my grandma ever taught me. Listen with patience, and hearts will answer." That night, when the hospital quieted and the city outside glittered under its sea of lights, William Carter made a decision that would change all of them. He could not undo the mistake of his pride, but he could build something new from its ashes. The Carters invited Ethan into their home, not as a guest, not as a charity case, but as family. Ethan, orphaned for years after losing his grandmother, found himself staring at the warm flicker of a fireplace in their brownstone house on the Upper West Side, hardly believing that belonging could feel this real. Shadow lay curled by the hearth, his breathing steady, his white scarf draped across his chest like a banner. Sarah nestled into Ethan's side, her small hands clutching his hoodie as if afraid he might vanish. William, quiet now, sat across the room, watching with a mixture of guilt and awe. Evelyn visited often, her sharp mind already forming plans for something greater than any of them yet imagined. Months passed, and the miracle became routine. Sarah's steps grew steadier, her voice returned, hesitant at first, then rushing like a river breaking its dam. By summer, she laughed often, her blonde hair flying as she ran short distances across the backyard. William's eyes followed her with wonder, never tiring of the sight. For every laugh, every cry, every stumble, he was there, not as a doctor protecting his reputation, but as a father rediscovering his child. It was Evelyn who suggested the center. One evening, as the group gathered around the dining table, Shadow resting at their feet, she leaned forward with her hazel eyes alight. What if we could give this hope to more children? Not just Sarah, but dozens, hundreds. Ethan has a gift. Shadow has a spirit that inspires. Why not build something lasting from this? Ethan, fork halfway to his mouth, froze. You mean a hospital? Not exactly, Evelyn smiled. A place where children who've been told they'll never walk, never speak, never hope again, can find people who believe in them. A rehabilitation center. We could call it, she glanced at Shadow, Shadow's Hope Center. William, still haunted but striving for redemption, nodded slowly. Yes, that's how I can make amends. And so it began. Over the course of the next year, the Carter family and Evelyn Brooks poured their time, resources, and hearts into transforming an old clinic building into something alive with possibility. Ethan worked tirelessly, training with therapists, sharing what his grandmother had taught him, guiding children with patience and determination. Sarah became the center's first miracle and its greatest ambassador, her laughter echoing through its halls like sunlight spilling through windows. And always, there was Shadow. Though age bowed his back and his steps grew slower, the German Shepherd's presence filled every corner of the center. He lay beside children in wheelchairs, sensing their fear and pressing his warm body against theirs until they calmed. He guided the hesitant to their first steps, his blindness turning into a gift. Proof that vision of the heart is stronger than sight of the eyes. His white scarf fluttered whenever the breeze swept through the open garden courtyard, a silent reminder that courage often hides in the most unlikely forms. 1 year later, on a bright spring afternoon, the courtyard of Shadow's Hope Center was filled with laughter. Children played, therapists guided, and parents watched with tears of gratitude. Ethan, now taller, his boyish features sharpening into young adulthood, stood at the edge of the garden. Sarah ran across the grass, her legs strong and free, her hair a halo of gold in the sunlight. She paused only to throw her arms around Shadow, who sat regally in the center, his blind eyes turned toward the sound of her laughter. William Carter stood beside Ethan, his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "You've given me back my daughter," he said quietly. "And more than that, you've given all of us hope." Ethan smiled, his green eyes reflecting both humility and determination. "It wasn't me, it was her, and him." He nodded toward Sarah and Shadow. At that moment, a gust of wind lifted Shadow's scarf, sending it billowing like a banner of victory. The children cheered, though they could not say why. They only knew it felt like a sign. The old shepherd lowered himself into the grass, content, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Light did not come from his eyes. It came from the lives he had touched, from the children now running where once there was only stillness. And as the scarf danced in the air, those who watched knew this truth. Sometimes the brightest light does not come from sight at all, but from the heart. In the end, Sarah's steps and Shadow's courage remind us that miracles are not distant things of the past. They live quietly in the patience of love, the strength of faith, and the grace of God. Even when the world says impossible, God whispers, "Not yet." Just as Sarah rose to walk and Shadow led without sight, so too can each of us rise from our struggles when we place our trust in Him. Life is full of unseen battles, but also unseen blessings. If God could turn blindness into guidance and weakness into strength, imagine what He can do in your own life when you choose to believe. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below to let us know how it spoke to you, and if you believe God still works miracles, write Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and keep you always.